Alright, hello and welcome. So, this video is to help you understand what frame power levels are and what the power level of the game means whenever I say that. To understand what the power level of the game means, you kind of have to understand what all of the Warframes do and why each one is good and what the good points are about it and which Warframes are lacking when compared to other Warframes that are at the top end of the power level of the game. So, we're going to go over a few things. First, let's go over what Excalibur does. Excalibur, in my eyes, is pretty much the most well-balanced Warframe in the game. He can do a whole lot. He can do pretty much everything. He's got a lot of shit going for him. So let's go over what his abilities are, and then we'll go over where his power level sits in the game. He's got Radial Blind. This is a support, defense, and offensive ability. This does all the things. It helps your team, it helps your defense levels, and it increases your output of damage when you're using melee. So it does all three of the most important things generally in the game, which is helping your team, making sure you don't die, and killing enemies. Those are all really important, varying degrees of importance per category. And then you have Exalted Blade, which is a really, really solid ability that does a lot of damage, is also defensive because you're constantly blocking from the front, even when you're swinging, and all that stuff. Radial Javelin, probably his weakest ability. It also applies a stun, though, and it's useful on some other levels in kind of a meta way. Slash Dash, you are invincible while doing this, and it's a good gap closer. It's a more defensive ability, less than offensive. In the early game, it's very offensive, though. So that's Excal's kit. He's very offensive-based, but has a lot of defensive qualities that support his offensive nature. And he has a side of a little bit of support for helping the team with Radial Blind and increasing their damage output, potentially, if they're using melee. So, let's illustrate that on paper. Or on my really terrible, shitty graph thing in Paint. So, Excalibur is highly offensive, but he doesn't have, insane damage, but he does the damage in a pretty wide area, which gives him a lot of damage. So, to represent Excal, let's use the color... you know what? Let's just use red. We'll use red to show Excal. Now we'll come down here, and Excal's level of power, the top end up here, he's at about here, in terms of damage output, which is pretty good. He does a lot of damage. A lot of his damage is safe, and a lot of his damage, because he can set up for finishers, goes through armor, which is the most important defensive thing in the game, making him really, really strong in terms of his damage and offensive capabilities. His support, on the other hand, not fantastic. It's on, the lower end. Let's say he's in, the lower 50% of support. Because his is fairly short range, it doesn't go through walls, but it's really good because blinds are one of the strongest crowd controls in the game. And then, in defense, because of those things, it being some of the strongest crowd control in the game, he has a much higher score, and his blocking from the front, his safe nature of his damage, all of that stuff puts him at, a little over 50% in the defense category, let's say. Now, let's move to another Warframe, Valkyr. So, Valkyr is a Warframe that is really good, but has a lot of problems. And the problems are not really problems, they're more just the weaknesses of the Warframe because the Warframe's strengths are how they are. So, let's go over these abilities. Ripline. This is mobility. This is just for her and actually doesn't really do a whole lot for her kit other than it has, some slight, very minor uses. It does damage, you can get around with it. It's more offensive in nature, but has the very tiny, tiny, itty-bitty amount of crowd control, no real team support with Ripline. Unless you're pulling them out of being stuck in walls, which is not a consideration. Warcry. This is the most supportive of Valkyr's abilities, but because this is an armor increase, which doesn't really make that much of a difference ever, and because the melee speed increase is not good on most of the Warframes you'll be matching with, it's not really good support. You're not really going to be able to do much with this unless you specifically build around it, which makes it worse for general use. But it's an okay supportive ability that helps Valkyr mostly be more offensive. Paralysis. This is just for Valkyr, it's not crowd control, this is setting up for finishers. This is just for damage. This is your can opener ability to get through armor, that's what it's for on Valkyr. and Hysteria. This is the most defensive ability in the entire game because it makes you completely invulnerable. It gives you lifesteal, and you do a fuckload of damage while you're doing it. It has a lot of downsides in that you're melee only. You don't really have any ways to help your team as Valkyr. You're pretty much a huge defensive ball that is just murdering enemies. That's what Valkyr does. And let's reflect that on the chart. So we open this up. Let's represent Valkyr with... Whoa, don't want to change the color of that one. Hold on a moment. Okay, there we go. Let's represent Valkyr with, let's represent Valkyr with pink. So it's a bit different from red. So in defense, it's as close as we could possibly get to the top. Actually, like, in the top. It doesn't get much better than that. Being completely invulnerable, it's real fucking hard to get better at defending yourself than not being able to die. It's real fucking hard. It is crazy hard to do that. In terms of support, though, fucking atrocious. There's like some minor bonuses, significantly below Excalibur, whose support is not that great. She has like super niche rolls down here in the bottom. In terms of damage, because her stuff is not in like a wider area, her damage only comes in much later. So in terms of her damage output, she's actually, in terms of like a rating, her damage is higher, but she can't do it in as wide of an area as Excal can, which lowers how good her damage is. So she's actually below Excal in terms of damage output, but she's close. She does a lot of damage. Single target damage is great. The single target is not super good in Warframe, so she's lower on the damage power scale. So you can see how these Warframes can differ, and it's worth noting, both Valkyr and Excal are in my A ranking, but they differ greatly. And that's fine, but you have to have a balance of like what's good, and you can be good for different things. So now let's take into account a Warframe that I don't much care for, which is Saryn. Okay, so let's go over Saryn's abilities. Saryn, can we, you know what? Let's just have you be normal, kind of. There we go. Don't have your like weird skirt happening. There we go. Okay, so one moment, let me pop that down. Sorry about that. This is Saryn. So Saryn's spores, they inflict viral procs. We have a lot of other ways to inflict viral procs, and the damage isn't very good. This offers no crowd control, and it doesn't help you defensively in any way. It does some damage, a little bit, but viral procking is something that you should be worried about kind of at the end of things, as opposed to wanting to like spread that around, and we have frames that are way better at doing that kind of thing. So spores, not very good. Molt, an unreliable way to distract enemies. And because Molt also works into your combos with damage, if this gets shot and killed before you can combo it and do your damage, it reduces your damage, which means your damage is really hard to use. It's not easy access, and Molt is also not a good defensive ability without, well, and even then it's not. If you use Regenerative Molt, it's an okay defensive ability, but it's still not very good, which is really unfortunate. Toxic Lash, because Saryn is pretty paper thin at the level where you're actually being like worried about how much you're doing like damage-wise with Saryn, Toxic Lash is terrible. Whenever you're taking the less damage on blocking from this ability, if you're blocking, that means you're not attacking. And the reason that blocking is good on Excal is because he can block and attack at the same time. That's the reason the block on Excal's Exalted Blade is so good. Because you can't do that with Toxic Lash, it means that you're either sitting there taking damage and doing nothing, just taking damage, which is useless, or you're getting more damage on your melee, but your Warframe's not tough enough to use that ability. So this is damage, but it's not reliable. And then we've got Miasma. So for Miasma to do good damage, what you have to do is you have to have spores on enemies, you have to do you have to get viral and toxin on them, then you have to have molt, and then you have to have spores on your molt, and then have your molt be damaged, and then hit 4. Otherwise, your 4 is a, like, 2-second stun? 2 or 3 second stun, which is terrible when compared to other crowd control frames, and doesn't really offer you anything. So you have to do all of this you have to get this damage in via all of these combinations of things But then at the end, you do significantly less damage than Excal will. And Excal will be able to do it faster and in a wider area than you, while being more defensive. So whenever you take all of those things into account, this is how it works out here. And obviously, you know what, let's make Saryn green, because she's Saryn. So in terms of support, she doesn't have any crowd control at all, so she's pretty much at the same level Valkyr is. Pretty much at the same level. Let's say those are right next to each other. Pretty much. She doesn't really crowd control anything. Her molt maybe distracts enemies for a couple seconds, so there's that. In terms of damage output, her damage is really, really clunky. Why is this one green? This one's supposed to be pink. One moment. Let me change that back. Back to Saryn. Alright. Back to Saryn. Her damage is really, really clunky, and she's not safe while she's doing the damage. And even then, her output is not very high. So she's pretty low on the damage scale, being below, like, the 50% mark, because she can't safely do her damage, and it takes her too much time, and it's clunky to do said damage, which makes her significantly weaker. And then in the defense category, while Excal has a lot of benefits from using his Exalted Blade and being able to radial blind and crowd control enemies for defensive purposes, and he has relatively high EHP, him and Saryn in terms of actual, like, health regularly, pretty close when you consider their primes. But the problem is that for Excal to do his damage, he's also crowd controlling at the same time, which makes it way easier for him to get his damage out, and he's doing higher damage and has can opener abilities, whereas Saryn does not have any way to open up enemies that have armor, and she has very low EHP. Even with regenerative molt, she's not very like, she can't heal fast enough in high level more than the damage she's taking in, and she can be instantly killed, even when you're using a bunch of defensive mods. And her damage output, even when you're doing her full combo with Molt, Spores, Toxic Lash, Miasma, and then you Molt with Spores on them, and all the enemies have Spores, and then you hit 4, it still doesn't do super high damage, and you're so vulnerable while you're doing that, that the setup has no payoff. So whenever we're talking about defense, she's also down here. So she doesn't crowd control, so she's not really supporting the team. But she's a little bit above Valkyr because she can put Viral on enemies, I guess. Viral doesn't actually matter that much because you lower the health of your enemies, but that doesn't actually really matter that much. Whenever enemies get to the point where they have that much health, you need to have crowd control along with a boost, similar to the way Nova does it. And in terms of defensive abilities, she can't really keep herself safe because she has no good crowd control, and her EHP and defensive abilities don't really matter in the high end. And then in terms of her damage is clunky, so you can't really do anything with it, which is like super unfortunate. So we went over like a mid-range frame, like Excal, and then we went over like a hard tank, Valkyr. She's a hard tank, let's be honest here, who also has some damage, but not really a lot of support. So let's go over Nova. Nova is the most similar to Saryn in the way, in the advantages that people give Saryn. So let's go over Nova. Let's go over Nova real quick, like. Okay, so Nova's abilities. Nova has her 1. Her 1 is her worst ability by a huge margin. You can use them, but they don't really do a whole lot. Sometimes they like stumble enemies a little bit. Not really worth using, honestly, most of the time for Nova. It's her worst ability currently. Antimatter Drop. This is a huge amount of damage affected by your weapon's ability to input damage into it, and you can make it into a huge range, but by default, at this like 15 range here, it's a really, really good power, because you can put damage in that gets multiplied and then nuke a huge area with it. So you have the ability to do damage in a relatively good combo that you can set up prior to engaging enemies, which makes it really, really good, and you can do a lot of damage with that. Combined with her other abilities, it's super strong. Wormhole. Wormhole gives Nova an escape, defensively, from all kinds of situations. It gives her support with teammates, being able to get them through things, specifically in the raid, being able to like skip doors and all that stuff. Wormhole is a pretty good mobility skill that also helps your teammates out, albeit in less scenarios. And then we have Molecular Prime, which is Nova's like big bread and butter ability. So this spreads out, marks all enemies for an enormous amount of time, slows them by 75% when you're modded to slow enemies down. It makes them take double damage, and they explode when they die, and this can cause chain reactions at lower levels whenever enemies will die from that explosion damage. So you have a huge amount of crowd control, which you should be using pretty much all the time, which makes Nova actually hugely defensive, provided you are being at least a little bit careful. It makes her antimatter drop better because you're doubling the damage that you put into your antimatter drop already. And it helps your team immensely because that slow, it doesn't only apply to you, it applies to the enemies who are now basically like, they're like a fourth of what they were, and they take double damage, and everything is just way better for your entire team because you're using such enormous crowd control. So, that makes us go back here. And what does Nova have? Well, let's put Nova... Let's make Nova's blue. We'll do blue for Nova. So, in terms of her defensive capabilities, she's not that much tougher than Saryn, but because of the way her 4 works and that it's really reliable crowd control, she is just a little bit less defensive than Excal. Because her personally, she can't take a lot of damage, but if she's careful, she can make it work for her. But you're relying on your 4 to get these enemies down to a level where you can survive them. In terms of support, however, because you're doing this massive slow and you're giving your team a double damage boost on all enemies you mark, that's a huge amount of crowd control, it's a huge amount of damage increase for your entire team, and it's just like one of the best crowd controls in the entire game. It's just amazing. Which means, in terms of support, Nova's like way up here. Nova has an amazing 4, plus added in with that the like niche uses of her wormhole and using it with herself also helps her in the defense category. And then in terms of damage, because her 4 is doubling damage, that's already a huge boon. That's amazing for all your weapon purposes. That's fantastic. On top of that, you have antimatter drop, which can do a massive amount of damage to a huge number of enemies. And you can set it up at any time. You can just immediately set it up and have it ready with you in, like, you're starting a defense wave. We'll throw antimatter drop, fill it up with damage, defense wave starts, enemies spawn in, nuke them. And it's a really easy setup combo that makes sense, and it's relatively easy to use, if a bit unwieldy in certain environments. Which means it's really good for damage. Which puts Nova slightly under Valkyr, because Valkyr can dish out massive single target damage. Nova is a little bit more AoE focused, which puts her a little bit under Valkyr in terms of her damage output. So there's kind of a trend here. In fact, Novas are like pretty much inverse of where Saryn sits, because she's really good and she has like a balanced kit that can do a whole lot of shit. Basically, whenever you take all these like power levels into account, if you compare Nova, Valkyr, and Excal, you look at them and you go, oh, well, I could use this guy for that. Oh, I could use her for this. Oh, and that one, I could go do this with this. Well, what is this good for? And then if we take Frost into consideration, it's like, well, he's amazing at defense, and he's good at some other like crowd control type things, but not necessarily great at killing enemies. His damage is pretty low. But he has really, really high defense and support stats that can fill in the gaps for him. But then you look at frames like Saryn, who don't have much crowd control, are not defensive, and their damage is unreliable or low. And we wonder why. That's the reason that Saryn is bad, is because the power level of the game that we're sitting at currently is like the top end is like Nova, Excal, and Nova, Excal, like Frost, Valkyr, Wukong, like frames like that have like balanced kits that do like things really well but have pretty balanced overall levels of things. That's like the top end of power. So whenever you introduce a frame that doesn't do anything like super good, or doesn't excel at least a little bit in all ways, they're not good because they're below the power level of the game, which is bad. Also, it's worth noting, my S-rank frames, Loki and Trinity, kind of sit outside the power level of the game, as they're kind of, like, over-tuned, and are more crazy. So, okay, we'll throw Trinity onto this, just to show. And let's make Trinity... What color should we make Trinity? We'll just make Trinity black. Black is fine. Why not? So, Trinity is one of, like, these outliers, because she has the ability to do so much. So whenever you look at Trinity, defensively, she can give you 99% damage resistance, so she is, like, right on the fucking heels. Oops, wrong thing. Right on the fucking heels of Valkyr. Like, almost at that level where Valkyr is, because she's got crazy damage resistance. In terms of support, she can give the team 99%, or she can be filling them up with energy. So it's pretty much as high as it fucking gets over here. Like, this is, like, the shit that's going down. So she has two pretty much completely max statistics, and damage is less important. I didn't mention this before. Damage is less important than support and defense. Support being the most powerful thing, because support includes crowd control, which is the most powerful thing in the game. So, Trinity is the best in... well, not the best. She is almost the exact top of the line that you could possibly get in the two most important things in the game, which is defending and, like, supporting. But in terms of her damage, it's way down here. Her damage is not great. But because damage is not nearly as important as support and defense, she's an S-rank frame because it's fucking insane. She's got insane abilities, and she's, like, probably a little over-tuned, if I'm to be completely honest. But that's what Trinity looks like here, and that's why Trinity's so fucking crazy. And then, also, let's throw Loki in here. Why would we not? At this point, we're just going over, like, the S-rank frames and where they sit and why they're S-rank. So let's do... kind of color. I need, like, more colors. That's, like, another green. We'll do yellow. Loki can be yellow, sure. Okay. With this. So, yellow... Okay, so, defensively, Loki's really high up here, because he can go invisible, and he can stay invisible for a long, 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 long time. So he's way up here, and yellow might be a little hard to see. But that's fine. He's way up here, he's sitting a little bit below Valkyr and Trinity for obvious reasons, because he still has vulnerabilities that are present. Like, AoE will knock him down, walking in front of enemy gunfire. Most of these things are going to be his fault, but he's crazy defensive. And he's not, like, invulnerable or close to invulnerable in any way. In terms of support, Radial Blind is fucking crazy, and you just nullify, like, enemies' abilities to do fucking anything, basically, because you turn them into melee enemies. Combine that with his Augment, their radiation proc, they're fighting each other, they can't do anything, it's a huge area, it's easily recastable, and there's so much you can do with that ability, that he's also sitting up here in, like, kind of the top end of support, also. Because it's so good. Because you're doing even more than Nova is capable of doing with her 4, because while Nova is slowing enemies, Loki is basically just making enemies not matter. Like, enemies are not even a consideration in a lot of ways for any frame that's not in melee range, which most frames are not. So you're just corralling the enemies and, like, forcing them to do a thing they're not really designed to do in a lot of ways, which is amazing. And then, even on top of that, because invisibility gives you so much, like, of a melee bonus, and it's so good in melee, the damage output of Loki, while most people would say it's 0, is actually really, really good. Because with melee and being invisible, it's very safe until, like, crazy far in, and you can still do it crazy far in if you're good, that you can do so much safe damage that, while Trinity's way down here, Loki is at, like, just below Saryn levels of damage, because his damage is a little niche, and you have to get close for it, which is dangerous for Loki. But he still does, like, a respectable amount of damage. And he has no damaging abilities, he just has things that help him out. And then on top of that, he has Decoy, which is some minor support, but also Switch Teleporting, and he has other things that are going for him to make him quick. He's the fastest in the game, like... well, the fastest base run speed in the game, at least. And he's, like, you can see the Warframes that are my S-rank frames crazy excel in support and defense, because those are the most important things in the game. So yeah, this is, like, kind of how the power level of the game is metered out. There's damage, how much damage you can do, how much you're killing people. Support, which is really important for helping your team, and, like, applying crowd control and stuff like that. Defending, which is minorly crowd control, and how well you stay alive. And support and defense are more important than damage. The damage is a nice aside, and if your damage is high enough, it becomes a really good defense. And a lot of that is in the way where Excal gets some of his defensive potential also. I hope this was specific enough, and that I didn't get too off track with how things work, and how I, like, visualize what makes a power good, and what is important in Warframe for doing stuff. So yeah, that's gonna be the end of this video, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions, I'm gonna be streaming today, so come hang out, and if you need me to be more specific on anything, please ask.